Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I'm Stephen Carroll, and this is Here's Why, where we take one news story and explain it in just a few minutes with our experts here at Bloomberg. China's President Xi Jinping has been on a European tour visiting France, Hungary and Serbia. Yet not everyone is happy to see him. Senior European officials have been talking tougher on China.
China is aiming to capture and internalize all parts of the supply chain.
Knowing that you have been played, of course, teaches you that you need to watch out to be much more observant.
We do support free trade, we do believe in it. We of course also need to make sure that when trade is taking place, that it is on a truly level playing field.
I remain confident that more progress can be achieved. At the same time, we stand ready to make full use of our trade defense instruments.
China is a global economic powerhouse. Its size and influence make it almost unrivaled as a trade partner. And yet, here's why China wants to keep Europe happy. We've got our Asia government and politics correspondent Choong Wilkins with us to explain. Hi, Rebecca. Why did Xi want to make this visit to Europe?
Well, the overarching goal here and the thing to remember really is that what we've seen over the last few months and really over the last year is that the European Union has moved much closer to the US when it comes to rolling out the sort of litany of probes into Beijing's subsidies for various clean tech industries and sort of resorting to this theme of de-risking. And so really the goal for Xi Jinping is to put a lot more space between the European Union and the US and to sort of try and pause this momentum as it seems the EU sort of seems almost to be moving lockstep with the US on many of these investigations at the moment.
Well, let's talk about where he went as well. So France and Hungary, EU members, and Serbia, which isn't. What's behind the choice of these countries?
Yeah, this is really fascinating, I think. It's a very carefully curated trip. And sort of most simply put, I think all three of these countries represent, to Xi Jinping at least, nations that move somewhat independently in very different ways from the EU itself. Now, France, of course, an obvious sort of leading member of the EU, a country that was said to have actually backed one of these first key probes into Chinese EVs last autumn, but has typically tried to present itself as a middle country between the US and China, has resisted any sort of pressures to be pushed into naturally following the US policy on various things and somewhat shown a more independent stance. When you look at Hungary and Serbia, quite a different picture there. These are two countries, both of which are not just more economically open to China, but much more closely geopolitically aligned too. So they have close ties to Russia, for example. They are big supporters of China and Russia's vision of the so-called multipolar world. So politically speaking, Xi Jinping finds himself much more comfortable in that arena too. And that portion of the trip, we really see Xi trying to showcase the benefits of doing business with China and keeping your trade lines open. With, for example, BYD opened its first factory in Europe in Hungary. That was coveted by France and Germany as well. Instead, Xi sent it to Hungary. We also have sort of potential other deals for more automakers there. We have cattle battery operations, setting up a home base in Hungary too. So that really is about showing just the kind of benefits, I suppose, that China can bring.
You mentioned that word de-risking, or that term de-risking, which the European Commission President had used last year to describe relationships with China. She talked about de-risking, not decoupling. It doesn't sound particularly positive. Then, as you mentioned, we've had these wave of EU trade probes as well. Does this visit qualify as a charm offensive from Xi?
I think certainly charm offensive from Xi Jinping, but somewhat we also see that from Macron too. I mean, the sort of tension always when it comes to the EU is that the EU has its own agenda, but then, you know, sometimes that can be challenged or that can be in conflict with the individual agendas of the various member nations. You know, Germany and France have their own reasons for wanting to cultivate more positive relations with China, for example. And so we always see that sort of strained tension tensions between what might be a priority for the EU versus some of these leading EU nations. And Hungary is another important voice here, sort of for strategic reasons, because it has that ability to block or slow some of those probes, for example. So it is a way that China can influence the direction of EU policy, as well as, of course, offering that potential channel into the single market.
Yeah, of course, the unique nature of the EU allows that sort of opening to happen. Is the EU-China relationship at risk of turning sour, though, Rebecca? Could the EU decide to decouple from China?
I don't think we're sort of at that last chance saloon stage yet, but I certainly think that Beijing is concerned that there is a turning point, that if the EU continues on this path with the same sort of voracious appetite to potentially introduce harmful tariffs and so on, it will bring it much closer to the US. Now, full decoupling, most would agree is nearly impossible because of just the natural interconnected natures of the economy. But what could happen is we could see very high tariffs and other forms of frictions introduced on these key sectors that China, for its part, is relying on in its sort of new model for growth and its revived blueprint, the so-called 3 new drivers of growth. That's solar panels, EVs and batteries. And because of the weak demand that we see in China itself, it has increasingly relied on exports to continue benefiting economically from those 3 key sectors.
Rebecca Choong Wilkins, our Asia Government and Politics correspondent, thank you very much. And for more explanations like this from our team of 2,700 journalists and analysts around the world, search for Quick Take on the Bloomberg website or the Bloomberg Business app. I'm Stephen Carroll and this is Here's Why. I'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening.